Okay, so what we're going to talk about next is going to be the different types of respiration besides aerobic respiration that can happen. So here you can see anaerobic respiration, and anaerobic respiration is going to obviously happen without oxygen being around. So what's going to happen is you've got methanogens, are a type of bacteria that are going to do this, and what they will do is instead of using oxygen as their electron acceptor, they're going to use carbon dioxide, and a byproduct they're going to make is methane, and that's where they get the name methanogens. Another group are going to be sulfur bacteria, and what they're going to do is use inorganic sulfates and reduce those to hydrogen sulfide. And so those are going to be the two main types of organisms that do anaerobic respiration. Now, one thing is that we've got all these NADHs that we talked about in all three of those stages in the beginning that we're all dropping off electrons at the electron transport chain. And, obviously you can run out of that. So what's going to happen is that those NADHs are going to drop the H off with the electrons, and then it can be recycled. So there's a couple of ways this can happen. And if we look back at this video here, you can see one thing that can happen is those electrons are going to get picked up by oxygen, and then you're going to form water eventually because there's going to be hydrogens floating around. So that's how water can be a byproduct, and that's also how we were talking about how oxygen is an electron acceptor. That's how aerobic respiration works. Now, another thing that can happen is fermentation, and this is something that we can do in our bodies when we don't have enough oxygen, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay, so now let's talk about acetyl-CoA. If you remember, acetyl-CoA is going to be the product of pyruvate oxidation, and that was stage 2. So what's going to happen is your body and your cells are going to look at how much ATP you have, and if it looks like you have enough, there's no reason to make more. So let's say that you've eaten a jelly donut and you have a lot of ATP from that, and you don't go and work it off. Eventually, it's going to get to the Krebs cycle right before it, and it's going to say, you know what, you have enough ATP, you're not burning it up, let's put it into storage. And that's when your body decides to store things as fat. It can go in the opposite direction if ATP levels are low. If ATP levels are low and you need more, then it's going to pull and keep making more ATP. So when we talk about the total amount of ATP that's made, technically it's 36 to 38 because you had 2 in the first stage, 2 in the third stage, and then 32 to 34 in the last stage. So that's 36 to 38 total. That's theoretical though. Actually what's going to happen is there's leaks in the membrane, that you can use that proton gradient for other uses. So we actually only get about 30 ATPs total. So we lose a couple here and there with those processes. That's only a third of the energy that's in the bonds in glucose. So we're not very efficient at getting ATP out of glucose. Okay, so we're going to talk about this more in class, but when we look at relative levels of ATP versus ADP, that's when you can either gain or lose weight. So if you have high levels of ATP, then what's going to happen is you aren't using a lot of energy, so you're going to store it as fat. If you have high levels of ADP, then it's going to trigger your cells to keep making more ATP because you're burning it off. So if you have high ATP levels, like up here, that's going to be like if you ate the jelly donut and then went and sat on the couch. If you had high ADP levels, that'd be like if you ate a couple carrots and then you went onto a treadmill. So that's the way you can think about it. And then this last thing I want to talk about is going to be fermentation. So fermentation is going to be an alternative way that we can do respiration if there isn't enough oxygen present. And there's two ways that it can happen. There's ethanol fermentation, which is going to be what we use to make alcohol or to make bread rise and things like that. And what's going to happen is it's going to produce CO2 as a byproduct, and it's also going to make ethanol. Now, this is not something that we can do in our bodies, but what we can do is lactic acid fermentation. So if you think about it, if you go jogging, the first thing that's going to happen is you're going to start breathing more. And the reason you're breathing harder is because your cells and your mitochondria need more oxygen to accept those electrons in that whole process that we talked about. Now, what can happen is if you get working too hard, then you're not going to be able to breathe hard enough to get the oxygen into your body. And so what's going to happen is you're going to switch over to fermentation. And fermentation doesn't make a lot of ATP. And so what's going to happen is you're going to have lactic acid be a byproduct, and that's going to build up in your muscles. And when you have lactic acid build up in your muscles, that's when you feel the burn. So when you actually feel your muscles burning, that's lactic acid inside of them. Now, technically, if lactic acid stayed in your muscles, it could kill you. But most of the time, what happens is we end up failing or we end up giving up because we can't do it anymore. And when the second you stop using those muscles, the lactic acid can get out. Sometimes, if you have like a real hardcore athlete and they kind of collapse, that could be due to lactic acid buildup that's too much and they're just overdoing it. So that's the difference with fermentation versus regular aerobic respiration. And that's it for chapter 9.